Welcome to Pastor Andrew's Inspirations. If you enjoy these videos, please click the red square to the lower right side of this video for more messages. Today, we will be talking about the biblical name of Abraham. Abraham is the common patriarch of the Abrahamic religions, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In Judaism, he is the founding father of the covenant of the pieces, the special relationship between the Hebrews and God. In Christianity, he is the spiritual progenitor of all believers, Jewish or Gentile. And in Islam, he is seen as a link in the chain of prophets that begins with Adam and culminates in Muhammad. The narrative in the book of Genesis revolves around the themes of posterity and land. Abraham is called by God to leave the house of his father Terah and settle in the land originally given to Canaan, but which God now promises to Abraham and his progeny. Various candidates are put forward who might inherit the land after Abraham, and while promises are made to Ishmael about founding a great nation, Isaac, Abraham's son, by his half-sister Sarah, inherits God's promises to Abraham. Abraham purchases a tomb at Hebron to be Sarah's grave, thus establishing his right to the land. And in the second generation, as heir, Isaac is married to a woman from his own kin, thus ruling the Canaanites out of any inheritance. Abraham later marries Keturah and has 6 more sons. But on his death, when he is buried beside Sarah, it is Isaac who receives all Abraham's goods, while the other sons receive only gifts in Genesis chapter 25, verses 5 to 8. The Abraham story cannot be definitely related to any specific time, and it is widely agreed that the patriarchal age, along with the Exodus and the period of the Judges, is a late literary construct that does not relate to any period in actual history. A common hypothesis among scholars is that it was composed in the early Persian period, as a result of the tensions between Jewish landowners who had stayed in Judah during the Babylonian captivity, and traced their right to the land through their father Abraham, and the returning exiles who based their counterclaim on Moses and the Exodus tradition. Terah, the 9th in descent from Noah, was the father of 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. The entire family, including grandchildren, lived in Ur of the Chaldees. According to a midrash, Abram worked in Terah's idol shop in his youth. Haran was the father of Lot, and thus Lot was Abram's nephew. Haran died in his native city, Ur of the Chaldees. Abram married Sarah, who was barren. Terah, with Abram, Sarah, and Lot, then departed for Canaan, but settled in a place named Haran, where Terah died at the age of 205, in Genesis chapter 11, verses 27 to 32. God had told Abram to leave his country and kindred and go to a land that he would show him, and promised to make of him a great nation, bless him, make his name great, bless them that bless him, and curse them who may curse him, in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran with his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and the substance and souls that they had acquired, and traveled to Shechem in Canaan, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 4 to 6. Then he pitched a tent in the east of Bethel. There was a severe famine in the land of Canaan, so that Abram and Lot and their households traveled to Egypt. On the way, Abram told Sarah to say that she was his sister, so that the Egyptians would not kill him, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 13. When they entered Egypt, the Pharaoh's officials praised Sarah's beauty to Pharaoh, and they took her into the palace and gave Abram goods in exchange. God afflicted Pharaoh and his household with plagues, which led Pharaoh to try to find out what was wrong, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 14 to 17. Upon discovering that Sarah was a married woman, Pharaoh demanded that Abram and Sarah leave, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 18 to 20. When they lived for a while in the Negev after being banished from Egypt, and came back to the Bethel and Ai area, Abram's and Lot's sizable herds occupied the same pastures. This became a problem for the herdsmen, who were assigned to each family's cattle. The conflicts between herdsmen had become so troublesome that Abram suggested that Lot choose a separate area, either on the left hand or on the right hand, that there be no conflict amongst brethren. Lot decided to go eastward to the plain of Jordan, where the land was well watered everywhere as far as Zoar, and he dwelled in the cities of the plain toward Sodom. Abram went south to Hebron and settled in the plain of Mamre, where he built another altar to worship God. During the rebellion of the Jordan River cities, Sodom and Gomorrah against Elam, in Genesis chapter 14, verses 1 to 9. Abram's nephew Lot was taken prisoner, along with his entire household, by the invading Elamite forces. The Elamite army came to collect the spoils of war, after having just defeated the king of Sodom's armies in Genesis chapter 14, verses 8 to 12. Lot and his family at the time were settled on the outskirts of the kingdom of Sodom, which made them a visible target, in Genesis chapter 13, verse 12. One person who escaped capture came and told Abram what happened. Once Abram received his news, he immediately assembled 318 trained servants. Abram's force headed north in pursuit of the Elamite army, who were already worn down from the Battle of Siddim. When they caught up with them at Dan, Abram devised a battle plan by splitting his group into more than one unit and launched a night raid. Not only were they able to free the captives, Abram's unit chased and slaughtered the Elamite king Chedorlaomer at Hobah, just north of Damascus. They freed Lot as well as his household and possessions, and recovered all the goods from Sodom that had been taken, in Genesis chapter 14, verses 13 to 16. Upon Abram's return, Sodom's king came out to meet with him in the valley of Shaveh, the Kingsdale, Also Melchizedek, king of Jerusalem, a priest of God Most High, brought out bread and wine, and blessed Abram and God. Abram then gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. The king of Sodom then offered to let Abram keep all the possessions, if he would merely return his people. Abram refused any deal from the king of Sodom, other than the share to which his allies were entitled, in Genesis chapter 14, verses 17 to 24. The voice of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, and repeated the promise of the land and descendants as numerous as stars. Abram and God made a covenant ceremony, and God told of the future bondage of Israel in Egypt. God described to Abram the land that his offspring would claim, the land of the Canaanites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaims, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites, in Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 to 21. Abram and Sarah tried to make sense of how he would become a progenitor of nations, because after 10 years of living in Canaan, no child had been born. Sarah then offered her Egyptian handmaiden Hagar to Abram, with the intention that she would bear him a son. After Hagar had found she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress Sarah. Sarah responded by mistreating Hagar, and Hagar fled into the wilderness. An angel spoke with Hagar at the fountain on the way to Shur. He instructed her to return to Abram's camp, and that her son would be a wild ass of man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the face of all his brethren. She was told to call her son Ishmael. Hagar then called God, who spoke to her, El Roi, thou God seest me. From that day onward, the well was called Beer-lahai-roi, the well of him that liveth and seeth me. She then did as she was instructed, by returning to her mistress in order to have her child. Abram was 86 years of age when Ishmael was born, in Genesis chapter 16, verses 4 to 16. 13 years later, when Abram was 99 years of age, God declared Abram's new name, Abraham, a father of many nations, in Genesis chapter 17, verse 5. Abraham then received the instructions for the covenant of the pieces, of which circumcision was to be the sign, in Genesis chapter 17, verses 10 to 14. God declared Sarah's new name. Sarah blessed her and told Abraham, I will give thee a son also of her, in Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 and 16. Abraham laughed and said in his heart, Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear a child? In Genesis chapter 17, verse 17. Immediately after Abraham's encounter with God, he had his entire household of men, including himself at 99, and Ishmael at 13, circumcised. In Genesis chapter 17, verses 22 to 27. Not long after, during the heat of the day, Abraham had been sitting at the entrance of his tent by the terebinths of Mamre. He looked up and saw 3 men in the presence of God. Then he ran and bowed to the ground to welcome them. Abraham then offered to wash their feet and fetch them a morsel of bread, to which they approved. Abraham rushed to Sarah's tent to order ash cakes made from choice flour. Then he ordered a servant boy to prepare a choice calf. When all was prepared, he set curds, milk, and the calf before them, waiting on them under a tree as they ate. In Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. One of the visitors told Abraham that upon his return next year, Sarah would have a son. While at the tent entrance, Sarah overheard what was said, and she laughed to herself about the prospect of having a child at their ages. The visitor inquired of Abraham why Sarah laughed at bearing a child at her age, as nothing is too hard for God. Frightened, Sarah denied laughing. After eating, Abraham and the three visitors got up. They walked over to the peak that overlooked the cities of the plain to discuss the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, for their detestable sins that were so great. It moved God to action, because Abraham's nephew was living in Sodom. God revealed plans to confirm and judge these cities. At this point, the two other visitors left for Sodom. Then Abraham turned to God and pleaded decrementally with him, from 50 persons to less, that if there were at least 10 righteous men found in the city, would not God spare the city? For the sake of 10 righteous people, God declared that he would not destroy the city. In Genesis chapter 18, verses 17 to 33. When the two visitors arrived in Sodom to conduct their report, they planned on staying in the city square. However, Abraham's nephew Lot met with them and strongly insisted that these two men stay with his house for the night. A rally of men stood outside of Lot's home and demanded that Lot bring out his guests so that they may know them. However, Lot objected and offered his virgin daughters who had not known man to the rally of men instead. They rejected that notion and sought to break down Lot's door to get to his male guests in Genesis chapter 19, verse 1 to 9. Thus confirming the wickedness of the city and portending their imminent destruction in Genesis chapter 19, verses 12 and 13. Early the next morning, Abraham went to the place where he stood before God. He looked out toward Sodom and Gomorrah and saw what became of the cities of the plain, where not even 10 righteous had been found, as the smoke of the land went up, as the smoke of a furnace in Genesis chapter 19, verse 27 to 29. Abraham settled between Kadesh and Shur, in what the Bible calls the land of Philistines. While he was living in Gerar, Abraham openly claimed that Sarah was his sister. Upon discovering this news, King Abimelech had her brought to him. God then came to Abimelech in a dream and declared that taking her would result in death because she was a man's wife. Abimelech had not laid hands on her, so he inquired if he would also slay a righteous nation, especially since Abraham had claimed that he and Sarah were siblings. In response, God told Abimelech that he did indeed have a blameless heart, and that is why he continued to exist. However, should he not return the wife of Abraham back to him, God would surely destroy Abimelech and his entire household. Abimelech was informed that Abraham was a prophet who would pray for him in Genesis chapter 20, verses 1 to 7. Early next morning, Abimelech informed his servants of his dream and approached Abraham, inquiring as to why he had brought such great guilt upon his kingdom. Abraham stated that he thought there was no fear of God in that place. and that they might kill him for his wife. Then Abraham defended what he had said as not being a lie at all. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. In Genesis chapter 20, verse 12. Abimelech returned Sarah to Abraham and gave him gifts of sheep, oxen, and servants, and invited him to settle wherever he pleased in Abimelech's lands. Further, Abimelech gave Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver to serve as Sarah's vindication before all. Abraham then prayed for Abimelech and his household, since God had stricken the woman with infertility because of the taking of Sarah in Genesis chapter 20, verses 8 to 18. After living for some time in the land of the Philistines, Abimelech and Phicol, the chief of his troops, approached Abraham because of a dispute that resulted in a violent confrontation at a well. Abraham then reproached Abimelech due to the Philistine servants' aggressive attacks in the season of Abraham's well. Abimelech claimed ignorance of the incident. Then Abraham offered a pact by providing sheep and oxen to Abimelech. Further, to attest that Abraham was the one who dug the well, he also gave Abimelech 7 ewes for proof. Because of this sworn oath, they called the place of this well Beersheba. After Abimelech and Phicol headed back to Philistia, Abraham planted a tamarisk grove in Beersheba and called upon the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, in Genesis chapter 21, verses 22 to 34. As had been prophesied in Mamre the previous year in Genesis chapter 17, verse 21. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham on the first anniversary of the covenant of circumcision. Abraham was 100 years old when his son, whom he named Isaac, was born, and he circumcised him when he was 8 days old. For Sarah, the thought of giving birth and nursing a child at such an old age also brought her much laughter, as she declared, God hath made me to laugh, so that all who hear will laugh with me. Isaac continued to grow, and on the day he was weaned, Abraham held a great feast to honor the occasion. During the celebration, however, Sarah found Ishmael mocking, an observation that would begin to clarify the birthright of Isaac. In Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 13. Ishmael was 14 years old when Abraham's son Isaac was born to Sarah. When she found Ishmael teasing Isaac, Sarah told Abraham to send both Ishmael and Hagar away. She declared that Ishmael would not share in Isaac's inheritance. Abraham was greatly distressed by his wife's words and sought the advice of his God. God told Abraham not to be distressed, but to do as his wife commanded. God reassured Abraham that in Isaac shall seed be called to thee, in Genesis chapter 21, verse 12. He also said that Ishmael would make a nation, because he is thy seed, in Genesis chapter 21, verses 9 to 13. Early the next morning, Abraham brought Hagar and Ishmael out together. He gave her bread and water and sent them away. The two wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba until her bottle of water was completely consumed. In a moment of despair, she burst into tears. After God heard the boy's voice, an angel of the Lord confirmed to Hagar that he would become a great nation and will be living on his sword. A well of water then appeared, so that it saved their lives. As the boy grew, He became a skilled archer, living in the wilderness of Paran. Eventually his mother found a wife for Ishmael from her home country, the land of Egypt, in Genesis chapter 21, verses 14 to 21. At some point in Isaac's youth, Abraham was commanded by God to offer his son up as a sacrifice, the land of Moriah. The patriarch traveled 3 days until he came to the mount that God told him of. He then commanded the servants to remain while he and Isaac proceeded alone into the mount. Isaac carried the wood upon which he would be sacrificed. Along the way, Isaac asked his father where the animal for the burnt offering was, to which Abraham replied, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. Just as Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, he was interrupted by the angel of the Lord, and he saw behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his thorns, which he sacrificed instead of his son. The place was later named as Jehovah Jireh. For his obedience he received another promise of numerous descendants and abundant prosperity. After this event, Abraham went to Beersheba in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1 to 19. Sarah died, and Abraham buried her in the cave of the patriarchs near Hebron, which he had purchased along with the adjoining field from Ephron to Hittite, in Genesis chapter 23, verses 1 to 20. After the death of Sarah, Abraham took another wife, a concubine named Keturah, by whom he had 6 sons: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua, in Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 to 6. According to the Bible, reflecting the change of his name to Abraham, meaning a father of many nations. Abraham is considered to be the ancestor of many nations mentioned in the Bible, among others the Israelites, Ishmaelites, Midianites, and Assyrians in Genesis chapter 25, the Edomites, Amalekites, and Kenizzites in Genesis 36. And through his nephew Lot, he was also related to the Moabites and Ammonites in Genesis chapter 19. Abraham lived to see his son marry Rebekah, and to see the birth of his twin grandsons Jacob and Esau. He died at age 175 and was buried in the cave of Machpelah by his sons Isaac and Ishmael in Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 to 10, and 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 32. This is the biblical name of Abraham, Adonai Nisi. The Lord is our banner. God's blessings be upon us all.